I'm Kelsey Mote. I work here at the Conservation District. I'm now going into my 7th year here. I'm our senior natural resource planner, and my emphasis is primarily in supporting agricultural operations and ranch operations. So, I definitely enjoy working with all of you. I've learned so much collectively from the hundreds of folks I've gotten to meet over the years, and through our U.S. Department of Agriculture Natural Resource Conservation Service training and planning, and my background being from the island with family and agriculture here, it's just really lovely to be able to build this network. And I hope that you yourselves have your networks here on the island and continue to build them for the benefit of your property and your livestock and of the island as a whole. So let's get going here. So tonight's presentation is going to focus on a lot of things because you all had a lot of great questions. We kind of phrased it as rural property prep. When is there not a good time to prepare on our properties? Our emphases will be on a mixture of different resources that you might find on your property, and you might have a particular goal in mind or a question. And as Allison mentioned, feel free to pop those in the chat as we go, and we'll make space at the end to answer as many as we can. I'm happy to stay a little later too if folks really want to answer those all as completely as we want. If not, we can follow up with you individually. So let's get going here. So I know Allison just mentioned kind of the history of the Conservation District, but I like to also look at it in the present moment. So as a planner at the Conservation District, I kind of see us working together as a partner, partnership, equal kind of give and take. We offer learning experiences like this one to empower you to achieve your land use goals. And I like to try and empower folks in that I like to teach you what I know, and so that way you can apply it on your own, as well as with help from me. Kind of ties in with the second bullet there, supports you through coaching. It's not a one-off relationship. Obviously, I've worked with folks for the whole time I've been here, and our land grows and ebbs and flows with us. And so you will likely have particular needs right now you want addressed, but over time you might find new needs come up, and that's why we're here. We're here to support and coach you through that in addressing those land use goals. And we like to connect you with our network of other state, federal, local nonprofits, private, and agencies who likely have other skills that might be more specific, and also potentially some financial assistance to help you achieve some of those goals. So help you build that network if you're new to the island, or expand it if you've been here. And then, as I mentioned, I like to learn as much from all of you as hopefully you'll learn from me. I know you all have likely a lot of experience and a lot of skills that already you are applying. And so I like to think of my brain as the hive mind that I bring all of your knowledge and I try to retain as much as I can. And as I visit with each of you individually on your properties, help try to connect in that world those different pieces that might benefit you most. And that conversation you have with me then further benefits others on the island in the future. So we use this model called conservation planning to help us in terms of helping you help your land. And conservation planning, it may sound a little jargony because it is, but I like to think of it more plainly as the planning of your property, planning the management of it, specifically of it in an ecosystem or kind of a watershed mindset. So holistically, looking at not just one facet, obviously that might be the most important facet at the moment, but looking at that facet in the context of the bigger picture of the property. And conservation planning lays a framework for that. So, we all have properties or backyards. It could be big, small, different sizes. It's scalable. Your land might, contain things like pastures that you want to address particular needs on the pasture. You might have an area where you have a garden or cropland. I consider pasture when you're grazing livestock, and then of course your hay that you get from that. If you hay it, that's also cropland. along with your gardens and orchards and things like that. You may have, your areas where you're stabling, your home, your utilities, all of the infrastructure. That's your farmstead, I like to call it. These different areas, looking at them as part of a bigger whole, but also narrowing in and each piece addressing those particular needs you have is kind of the mindset of conservation planning. So looking at the whole picture, but then narrowing in on pasture and on cropland and on farmstead, and then over here on the wild areas, that helps set the tone. So let's just get ourselves oriented here. I don't know necessarily how long all of you have been here on the island or in the Northwest part in particular. We've had a lot of folks who have moved in the past few years, which is awesome. Welcome if you're new. If you are a long timer like me and my family, you probably, this is old hat for you, but still you might learn something. We can focus on things. I like to kind of zoom out from our properties, first get ourselves oriented together of where we're at. So obviously there's lots of different angles you can, look at our area at, but knowing your landscape starts with knowing the context of the bigger ecosystem in which it exists, right? So we've got our geographical Pacific Northwest identity. We zoom in a little more. You might have heard the term Salish Sea, right? That particular water connection. Puget Sound is one of several major water bodies in the Salish Sea, all connected through these riverine and marine ecosystems. We're zooming in even further to our ecoregion. This is an ecoregion map, and if you're kind of swimming in color like me, it's okay. But really what this map is, it's an Environmental Protection Association map. And it's actually gone and incorporated things like the water connection, the plant connections, the climate, the hydrology, the soils, and all of those they combine and create these different areas of similarity. So zooming in, we're in this particular 2D, the name of that in particular doesn't necessarily mean anything other than knowing that those factors were factored in there. And then, many of you might have heard of the hardiness zone. As we zoom into Whidbey Island, many of us use, hardiness zones as like a determination of selecting plant species, your forage species, your native plant species and whatnot. And that's based on air temperature, essentially your average annual extreme minimum winter air temperature. So all these different factors, right, that go into the making up of your property in its bigger context of our area. I also like to take it a step further, just because I'm a visual person, and I like to orient folks to the fact that, like, beneath our feet, the things beneath our feet really are the building blocks of a healthy environment for our livestock, for ourselves, for our wildlife, for the plants. So soils are critical and often kind of overlooked, but soil temperature regimes, earthing. We are in a particularly, the Mesic soil temperature regime. I thought you might find that interesting. On top of that, there's soil moisture, the xeric soil moisture regime. So it's pretty cool to realize just how involved, our landscapes can be if we want them to be. And I set this up because I want to launch us in kind of to the first part of rural property prep that I think, like I mentioned, gets kind of overlooked or is kind of after the fact, kind of takes as a second step after the immediate concerns folks have. I am at fault for this as well on my own property when, my husband and I are building our house and we're going through this stuff myself. And I'm like, drats, figured out, needed to apply my own talk, right? So soils. If you look at this map, this is just kind of a high level overview. You see all these orange squiggly lines. Those are soil map units, and those are actually categorized by our U.S. Department of Agriculture and the National Cooperative Soil Survey Team nationally. And obviously they didn't go out and literally dig holes along those lines, but what they did do is over many, many decades, and are still doing to this day, is they're actually surveying areas and finding like soil types and then mapping them so that folks can then know their soils and know what management can impact those soils or how those soils impact management. So decision making like fence planning and forage, rotation and forage selection and all these questions you guys have really comes down to, well, what is beneath our feet? How does it work? What can I change? If I need to change it, what can I change? And those types of things. So I wanted to point that out. And I will show you as we go along tonight some tools that are really useful. And I encourage you to explore the soils on your property. Obviously, digging a pit and actually exploring it that way is even better. And that's something we can kind of explore together if you want to pursue that with us. So I wanted to take an example property and kind of guide you through this like concept of rural property preparation and looking at the soils, the water, the air, the plants, animal and livestock considerations, those major natural resource facets of a property, and help kind of show you some of the tools and some of the skills to be thinking about, and hopefully as we go along the lines answer some of those questions many of you put in the registration. So your questions really guided the design of this presentation tonight. So this property, I'm not going to call out exactly where it's at, but it is a Whidbey Island property. And, I tried to select something that was fairly, it's fairly similar to many of the folks I've worked with. We'll take a little closer look in a minute. I don't want to skip ahead of what's on it, but I wanted to start by pointing out that along with the soil component, you see all these little numbers. Those are the soil. It's a specific code soil scientists have, and we'll again delve into what those are and help you be able to decipher that when you go to a soil map or something like that. But besides that, the soils tie in typically with an ecological site. Different than an ecoregion, which is a much larger span of area, but an ecological site is one that is a specific stage of plant succession, if that makes sense. So, typically forest stands, they start after a disturbance and they grow up into, shrubs and, deciduous trees, and then they get, crowded out by overstory trees, et cetera, et cetera. Anyways, the ecological site, the reason why I share that is because for many of you who have questions around, what kind of plants might be best suited for my property for, say, planting a hedgerow, or maybe I want to put a windbreak in there. I want to just expand my native plant selections. Knowing your ecological site tied directly with your soils really can help you start to narrow in what might be the most appropriate starting place for native plants selection or forage selection. So really useful. So you might be wondering all these things. There's a lot of details here, believe me, it's all swimming upstairs. But it does hopefully at the end of this will come together and make a lot more sense. But I just wanted to kind of set the tone with, we're going to use this example and look at those key resources, so soil, water, plant, animal, and human/energy considerations, and air as well, for what things to think about for prepping your property now and in the future. Many of you come at it from what your vision is for the land. Goal setting is one of those things I think kind of happens as you go. I am at fault for not necessarily sitting down and thinking about how I'd like to use various aspects of my land. So I guess I'll say use my mistake. And if you are at a place where you're kind of getting to know your land, or maybe you're at a good pause point in some other projects, sit down and really take some time to think about what goals that you have in terms of your land. And, I like to organize them into these 4 categories that you see here. The quality of life goal you might relate to why you're actually on this piece of land. What drew you to it? What ties you to it? Why aren't you selling it and moving away? What about it inspires you and what will help you to stay inspired. The forms of production, a lot more about, the actual like utility of our land, how do we want to manage our pastures? How do we want to manage our, our gardens? How would we like to go and manage where the livestock are, stabling? Those kinds of production goals. The landscape description, I like to have folks take a step back and ask yourself, like, what is your aesthetic? What do you like about the land now, and what do you want to change? What do you like visually speaking? And what is that in terms of influencing your long-term goals for what you want it to look like in the future? And then lastly, and most importantly, I swear every single person I've worked with after meeting them a second or third time has always commented to me, man, I wish I had not done it all at once. I'm so tired, and I feel you. I say that to everybody because I'm the same way. How do you harness, I guess, in terms of your goals, how will you harness the limited time, energy, and resources that you do have to accomplish these aforementioned goals? And what timeline are you on in accomplishing that? So really take some time if you haven't had a chance to write those goals down, even if it's one per category. After goal setting, in terms of prepping your property, this is that same property where we had the little soil numbers and stuff, kind of an oblique aerial photo of it from 2016 that I could find. Now let's start to look at it in terms of the breakdown of where things are at, because that'll help us organize those goals. Maybe we have a particular set of goals for the cropland or the hay area. Maybe your pasture has a set of goals, maybe a forest and want to manage your forest a certain way. Your farmland or your farmstead, your outbuildings, your barns, your horses, your little garden next to your house, all those things. Each of those, knowing what land use they are, helps to organize those goals and increase that efficiency overall of how you execute your time and energy and resources that you have. Another thing that people often kind of learn as they go through talking with neighbors or just discovering out of the blue something because it unearthed itself out of the soil or something, is what has been done on that land. And I don't know if any of you have taken advantage of our historical mapping project, but we have a great online interactive mapper that has different little dots that correspond to an aerial photo that was taken at a specific time period of that area of Whidbey Island back in the 40s, 60s, and 90s. So besides Google Earth and the common tools you can have for satellite imagery, I highly, highly, highly suggest you check out the historical mapping project on our website, and take a look at your property. See what it looked like in the 40s. You might be surprised. A lot of the land has significantly changed over the last, 80 years or so. It's amazing. I've spent some time looking at oblique aerials and stuff of the island in the 30s and 40s, and it's just astounding how different it looks. And how things have been managed in the past does ultimately influence your land now, right? There may be areas of compaction where they had a large, large structure that who would have known now if you were just looking at it, right? So looking at that, you can see that there's been a lot of changes. Well, not a ton of changes, but there's been some changes on our example property. Like if we zoom in here and just compare 1963 to 2020, take a look and see if you notice anything. If you notice anything different between the two photos, feel free to pop it in the chat, or anything that stays the same. No pressure, but I figured just practicing that idea of using aerial imagery as a reference point. The buildings, yeah. there's a lot of buildings there in 63 that aren't there anymore, it appears, at least from these two. I tried to get them in similar sizes. They're not exact, but so there's a lot of infrastructure to the north there that doesn't exist. It looks mostly just like a kind of orchard or some trees there. So could impact management of how you want to use it. Maybe also advantageous. Maybe there's some existing hardened areas where you can put a new barn if you're wanting to do that. Another interesting thing I like to note to folks on these aerials is in the 63 photo, do you all see there's like in the lower right corner, and it kind of almost in like a, I don't know, like a C shape, if you will, there's like a line, a white line that goes from the lower right corner of that field and goes around and wraps around the property and goes up to the north corner. Do you see that? You don't see it in the 2020, but you see it in the 63 one. I have so many questions from people about where infrastructure is. They bought a property and there's literally no blueprint for where water lines are or irrigation lines or things that can't be located by a locate, like calling 811. And so these are really helpful, these aerials, because that's probably, I'm not 100% certain without ground truthing it, but from an aerial perspective, that would tip me off. There's some sort of drainage going on there. Maybe it's a drain tile. Usually discoloration like that in those black and white photos tells you that there's either a different substrate that's been put in there, so likely ditch digging and such, and maybe it's for the purpose of rerouting water. So a lot of water challenges folks have around drainage. It's often useful to see these historic photos to see maybe where there might be infrastructure that needs repairing or improving on. And kind of one other thing to think about too is not only how has it been used, how that will impact you, but the reason why you probably are here. What are your concerns? What are you experiencing in terms of the problems happening on the land that you want to address, or what do you want to try and prevent? And again, back to that land use piece, where on the land is it occurring? Is it in your pasture? Is it on the cropland? Is it in your forest? So keeping that in mind. I put the conservation concerns tool as a little blurb there that, so there's a tool USDA has that it's okay. I don't know, Allison, if you have an opinion about it. I think it's okay because it's a place to, let me do a quick share of it so you can see it real quick. Let's see if this works here. Hold on just a quick sec. Y'all see it? Yeah, okay. I like this because in terms of like actually getting things written down, this is a nice way to organize what your concerns and issues are. So they have this tool where you can actually go here and let's say your primary reason you're here tonight is because you want to improve your pasture quality, your forage quality. Well, you can go into the plants and it gives you, if my internet will get working along here, it gives you a lot of different choices. These are what we call resource concerns. There's actually over 45 of them, almost 50 of them in our world of conservation planning. And if you're not sure, if it doesn't quite match, obviously you can add your own, but it's nice because it does give you a place where you can then add the concern to your concerns list. And kind of like when you're like buying something on Amazon, you can like build your list up and then print it out. That's a super helpful thing, especially if you want to reach out and like work with me or work with an NRCS staff member or another technical professional to address some of those issues. Having that in one place is super valuable. And it also can help line up with your goals as well. Like which one of these do I want to work on first? So back to the presentation. And don't feel like you have to have the link memorized. We'll provide that to you. Oh, looks like Allison even already just put it in the chat. So great. And don't worry if you don't remember it, we'll give you a presentation or a sheet later. So now that we've got the resource concerns identified, I just wanted to show you real quick, look at all the resource concerns. There's so many. Oftentimes when I work with folks, they'll approach me I like to approach it from what is your resource concern and try to factor in, are there other potential concerns that could be addressed and solve the concern you have? Typically, nothing exists in a vacuum by itself, right? But these are how we kind of organize it: the soil, water, air, plant, animal, human, and energy considerations of the land. And of course, you're probably curious about solutions, like what best management practices would solve my concern. And so we'll talk about some of those. We're going to talk about specific ones that I know a lot of folks on the island have success with, but there's over 100 ones in our system, and that's just the USDA system. I'd say we're probably one of the more, I guess, broad, and we have a lot of reach, nationally. But I'm sure there's others that exist out there as well. I want to keep in mind too that there's 3 types of best management practices of those 100 plus. So vegetative practices, structural practices, and management practices. And I have a little asterisk by management because typically when I work with folks, I like to encourage folks to think first in terms of management. It's often the hardest one to do because it's kind of a behavioral thing. But typically, if we go and we reseed a pasture that's been particularly weedy for a while, I like to first have folks ask themselves, so what type of management has this been under to lead it to this point, and to this point that I don't like? And maybe it was the, previous owners that kind of managed it that way. So it's at that point. Okay, well, if you can find out how it was managed, then we can start to look at, okay, what management options could help improve that without having to pay a bunch of money to then purchase a bunch of grass seed and broadcast that seed and overseed it, right? So starting with management typically tends to yield, it's the hardest thing to start, but it's the longest term improvement. And then working, of course, on things like vegetative and structural practices as well. So soil, here's that property again. The colors correspond to those different soils, the numbers that you saw. So there's technically 3 different soils on this property. I'll zoom in here in just a minute to show you like what they are, but I wanted to show you where I got this from. I got it from the ICGeo map. Now let's see, I'm going to move this forward for a minute. Yeah, ICGeo map. It's a tool, and maybe Allison, you can put that direct link to the GeoMap in the chat. If you're not already aware of this, our county is by far ahead of the game from many of our counties, even our big counties that are our neighbors, in terms of its mapping capabilities. And the GeoMap provides you with all sorts of cool data layers that you can click on to learn more about your property. Things like where they think, where they think, but it's not exact. It's not the science necessarily of critical areas, things like wetlands or steep slopes or streams, where your well might, be approximately. Obviously you would know that, but it's kind of interesting that they have all this data on their GeoMap. I find it also useful because they have the soils data from USDA uploaded in there. They also have some old aerials from the 80s as well. Super useful tool and super intuitive, I'd say, overall, compared to some of the other tools out there. I also like it because it tells you what your zoning is. And most folks, you might be aware of what your property zoned as, but zoning determines what uses in our county are allowed. Now, we're non-regulatory at the Conservation District, but I'm not going to obviously recommend something that couldn't, that wasn't necessarily allowed without a discussion with the county folks. So knowing your zoning is super helpful because once you know your zoning, you know the uses that you can have. And obviously it's an evolving thing with county government, right? But I think it's super useful to know your zoning because that tells you then, it gives you a place in the municipal code to then go and easily find answers to your questions about, can I put my structure up? Do I need a permit for that? All those questions folks have and feel like they go into an abyss when they try to seek answers to that. It's right there at your fingertips. So here's the soils. I wanted to put a couple arrows to point out a few things. So obviously, this is a rural zone property. It's in the kind of soil temperature regime of Mesic, which means that it's got a mean annual temperature of 46 to 59 degrees Fahrenheit. It seems about right for our area, right? The soil moisture of xeric is more like moist, cool winters, warm, dry summers. The Mediterranean climate is what we call it. That yellow topsoil is called the Everett-Alderwood complex. And I'm giving you all this detail so that when you go to a lot of these tools, you know how to decipher what they're saying to help it make sense for your choices that you make on like your forage decisions, like knowing if that forage is well suited for the type of soils that the Everett-Alderwood complex is. It also tells you a little bit about the slopes. And that's super helpful for when you're siting structures as well, right? Having the more gradual slope, is important. Knowing it's not exact, obviously, to this property, but it does tell you, generally speaking, that soil occurs on a steeper sloped area. And then you can see over in the upper corner that kind of yellow red color, and that's a steeper sloped area. So, see, it kind of correlates. It also tells you a little bit about when it's a complex, that means there's multiple different soil types mixed together. And so that does make things a little more tricky, because you kind of have to know your land and the landforms where it's occurring, if it's in like a valley or on a hill slope or things like that, to kind of know which of those soil mixes it's most likely to be associated with. But it just gives you a good starting point for those soils that leads to everything else. So let's take, for example, let's use Everett, the yellow one. So I just went into a really great tool, and actually maybe we'll look at the overview and then I'll show you the tool so you can kind of know where I got this. Super useful for your property. The Everett soils on this land. So again, tells me that there's an Everett soil and an Alderwood soil. Well, I can actually go and find out, what does the soil profile typical of Everett look like? That will tell me at specific depths. Am I going to have kind of a high organic layer? Is it going to be pretty minerally and not, very low in organic matter? It's going to tell me something about how well drained it might be. This soil is called somewhat excessively drained to moderately well drained, because it's got two soils. There's kind of some differences in how it drains. So fairly drained. Compared to the purple one, the Showlander Spidens is poorly drained. So very different soils adjacent each other, but you wouldn't be able to necessarily discern that when you're standing in the pasture there. Tells you a lot about the organic matter that may be likely. Obviously, a soil test will tell you more specific to your site, but generally speaking, it gives you a good sense. I tend to say that soils that have organic matter that's 15% or greater, so very well managed pasture systems, those don't need as much inputs in terms of fertilizer or manure to maintain the nutrient needs of the forage. So it can vary. Knowing your organic matter is important that way. It also tells you a bit about the pH in the soil. And typically in our area, our soils have a lower, kind of more acidic pH. And that acidic pH affects forage growth, because a lot of our forage and a lot of our plants in general, not just grass or legumes or such, but a lot of those plants need a more neutral type of pH to really excel, unless it's like a native plant potentially. So, and it's because a lot of this land was cut over timberland. It was forest land, and the time it's been since that time, forest land has a much more acidic kind of soil. So it's taken a long time, unless this person's putting a ton of nutrients in there or managing their animals to a nutrient management plan where they're optimizing the grazing and the manure deposits for the benefit of the forage. It's probably going to stay acidic. And plus you'll find it will get more acidic if you put more manure on it. It's the liming that's super helpful to really acidic soils here, is doing a lime. And they used to do it pretty frequently, but I've not seen as much liming happening now. So now we've kind of reverted back to what it is. So let me show you the tool that this was on. Many of you, I know a few of you here I've talked to are actually more experienced in soils than I am. So hopefully I'm doing a good job. Let me pull up the web soil survey here. Okay, good. Can y'all see it? So I say web soil survey, but what I meant was soil web app. Web soil survey is a browser-based platform that essentially is this, but it's like a little bit more detailed than this. I like the UC Davis NRCS soil web app because I think it's a much more approachable app for the beginner when it comes to soils. You can essentially find your area. So if I like zoom way out here, right? There we are in Whidbey, North Whidbey, and you find your kind of approximate area and you find the soil of interest. And then what it will show you, if I click it here, it'll show you on the left this map unit composition, right? I told you the map units are what they do in soil surveys. And all the stuff I just told you exists right here. It takes a little digging, but not too much. If you click on, say, the Schollander, which is the dominant soil type of this complex of 3 different soils, and kind of use that as your representative of this soil type in your area, it'll tell you some stuff under the basic map unit data. That's where I got the poorly drained and the hydric soils. Those are soils that are more likely to be affiliated with kind of anaerobic conditions. And they hold water a lot more. But then you can actually click on the soil itself and it shows you kind of an example soil horizon, which is really cool. It will also give you an opportunity to click on different features like organic matter. And it does take a little getting used to, but like if you're not aware of how to read this, then you can always go do the fuse source data. And then, okay, now it's a lot more easy to show you. So they do it by horizon of soil. So they have a depth, soil horizon to a specific depth, and they have that kind of assessment of organic matter. So you can see the top layer is really high in organic matter, well, higher, and then you get down to more of that mineral layer, and so less, obviously, generally speaking. They use I believe labs for that for USDA. I purchased a soil lab manual. I want to read and figure out how they do it. Anyway, so great tool for getting oriented to your soils. How's everyone doing, by the way? Doing good? Doing okay? Okay. All right. Lots of shifting around here. Okay, so tips and tools for soil. I would say on the whole, if you've not done soil testing, it's a good time to do it. Like literally right now. Mid to late September is the time to test your soils, unless you're going to intend to put inputs like, say, fertilizer or turn your animals out and start doing a nutrient management plan in the spring, in which case doing that a couple weeks before you really start that management would be fine as well. But this is a great time to do soil testing because the forage and our plants in general are kind of exiting. I mean, they obviously are still growing, but they've kind of paused on it, and then they're going to do a slight regrowth, and then they're going to go dormant. And so they've exhausted a lot of their nutrient stores that they've taken up this year. So it gives you kind of a baseline of, okay, now I know how much nitrogen in general I should probably apply. And I can do that in a couple different ways, right? Through purchasing of fertilizer or of applying manure. This is also a good time to tie in your soil testing with manure testing. So if you collect manure and you want to know what actual nutrient values exist in your manure, you can do that. And some labs do the same thing. Make sure it's an accredited lab, and I'll send a link about where those are because they have a higher kind of quality assurance program for making sure they give you correct results and things like that. Another good thing to think about for soil management is heavy use areas or sacrifice paddocks. Those areas closest to where we're going to have the most use by our livestock. This helps greatly with reducing mud and easier in terms of chore efficiency for manure collection. It also obviously protects the soil and protects your livestock's health. So all around great practice. It's good in general too to just limit any sort of compaction based work, whether it's through equipment or livestock concentration on areas that are very wet in the winter months, because that's when, especially if you're wanting to grow grass, that's when you're going to have the plants in dormancy, and you definitely don't want to trample those. Another kind of key vegetative practice that a lot of folks are interested in is cover cropping. And essentially in pasture management, you are cover cropping, depending on what you do with that. If you're just grazing, or if you graze and hay it, maybe you leave a little bit of that and now you're essentially cover cropping. But if you've got a garden and you want to, put in a unique, maybe an annual legume or something like that, Austrian pea, or you want to explore another new species like that winter rye, cover cropping is a great way to keep soil from being bare at times when there's a lot of water, because water, raindrops hitting bare soil creates a lot of sedimentation and a lot of erosion issues, and that just further down the road can be a real issue for you for managing the land. And so kind of the key insight about that is to understand your soils, right? If I haven't drilled that in, hopefully I have now. Understand your soils, know what their suitabilities are best for and their limitations, because trying to fit a square peg in a round hole, sometimes you can do that, but it does take a lot of time, money, and energy to do that. So trying to figure out what your soils are and then kind of meet yourself in the middle, right, where your goals are with the soils capabilities, that ultimately means the sustainability for you and for your livestock long term. Water, that's the second highest important thing, right? Soil and water. We used to be called Whidbey Island Soil and Water Conservation District. I don't know if you knew that before. We were just Whidbey Island Conservation District, because those were the two, and still are the two main resources that are of most importance for managing and conserving both on your property and nationwide. So we exist for primarily soil and water because they influence everything else. And many of you had questions about water. That geomap, IC geomap, is great in terms of giving you a starting point for where water resources might exist on your land. I say where maybe and not where exactly, because some of the county's mapping tools are not exact science. They're more like LiDAR based, and they may be actually in error. Sometimes, like this stream system here, I'm fairly certain I've been there and there is not a stream system. However, what that might allude you to is that is a low area that may have more likely to have poorly drained soils. Hence that purple soil that's poorly drained, right? So it starts to give you a sense of where your water resources and where your water concerns might be. Additionally, it talks about things like the critical aquifer recharge areas. So that yellow color is, this property is in an aquifer recharge area, which means that, drinking water on our island is from aquifers, unless you live in the city of Oak Harbor, in which case you get your water from the Skagit River, carted via Anacortes, if you're in actual city. So aquifers are critically important to us, and knowing that, oh, hey, my property is of medium, that the yellow is medium susceptibility, red is like high susceptibility for aquifer recharge. Medium means that, like, yay, water can get down there, it can get down there quicker. And so the things you do on your land, the nutrients and things you put on your land will have an impact to that. over time. Other things to think about are ditch systems that might be there, either inconspicuously, like we saw in that aerial photo, or very obviously. And how are those working? Are they working? It might take an engineer to take a look at that and actually see, is that working? But I can help you kind of get a head start on some of that stuff. And importantly too, are our wells, where we site, where we have animals in confinement or in close proximity to wells, that can impact the water that you drink. So we tend to say, encourage folks 100 feet around the wellhead, and ideally limiting access to that wellhead by any livestock. Same with water, power, and septic. And so water, you got to kind of ask yourself from a prep perspective, okay, I'm having a water issue. Is it related to a recent storm event? Is it actually more about the soils and their ability to hold water, or maybe even slow that water, like poorly drained soils, and that's the issue? Or is it an actual management thing where there's a broken tile drain that needs to be found out and remedied? These are the questions you got to think about when you have water on your land and you're wondering why it's there when it shouldn't be. Those origins are really important to finding a good solution. And so some things to consider, not just the quantity of water and is it in the place you want it to be, but also what are your uses for it? Are you wanting water for your livestock? Where are those watering systems? Are they protected from frost? Things like that. Are you wanting to irrigate your pastures? Irrigation can happen and does happen. Is not as common, I'd say, in our area. The folks usually do let the grass go dormant for August and they do the regrowth naturally, but we are having more droughts, right? I haven't seen a lot of rain this year, and typically I experience a lot more in August. And so I'm kind of like looking at my grass and I'm like, maybe I should have an irrigation system, right? But there's a whole piece to that in terms of setting up an efficient irrigation system, finding the right type of irrigation for you. And also it is something that is requiring of permits if you don't already have one, because you're drawing from a shared resource there, a groundwater right. Drainage, obviously, drainage infrastructure is often failed drainage because it's been put in over 100 years ago or nearly 100 years ago. So failed drainage infrastructure tends to cause a lot of water quantity issues, and a lot of like mismanagement of impermeable surfaces. So like all of your driveway and roof and barn, all those areas where that water is collecting from storm events, is it being directed and diverted to an area that is not where your livestock is? Is it being filtered correctly? All of those questions you kind of have to ask yourself, along with what you're putting on the land, and how those work together. So some tips. Think of it in terms of, remember I said vegetative, structural, and management practices. So ideally with water, it's best to keep water that's clean. Things like gutters and downspouts, the 4 R's of nutrient management, keeping your manure under a roof structure away from water, keeps the compost product at the end much more viable for using or for export on, say, your friend's garden. But it also helps prevent nutrient runoff. Stormwater practices like rain gardens or French drains, those are great for controlling the water where you want it to go. And of course, things that are structural, like your drip irrigation systems for water efficiency, and even, buffers. You can have an orchard that's also a buffer. We have a project right now we're working on where we're exploring this idea of, areas that are wetter, transforming those into perennial cropping systems that are essentially plants whose roots can be in water for a while, but then graft on apples or graft on pears, and have this interesting and making I guess a lemonade out of a lemon for those wet areas that you really can't tackle with any drainage infrastructure or anything. So vegetation can really be a key there. It intercepts that water too. And I kind of mentioned it already, but understanding your soil and knowing how water flows through it really can affect what your drainage plans are and also what your irrigation needs are. It all goes back to soil, doesn't it? Air, I'll just kind of gloss over, but it is important. Most of us don't think about it because we don't see it. But from a prep perspective, think about it in terms of, I do sometimes we'll get somebody calling us and they're like, my neighbor has this, and we don't obviously, we don't go out and do any sort of enforcement or anything. We try to encourage folks to talk to their neighbors, get to know their neighbors. But like odors and particulate matter, like dust and smoke and stuff, all those air considerations of managing your property do impact both you and your animals and your family and your neighbors. And so managing things like, the compost and where it's sited and, your equipment's age and how if you're tilling for maybe you're reseeding and you're going to till, the timing of your tillage, things like that are something to think about from a prep perspective. It definitely increases that neighborly relation, doesn't it? So some tips and tools for that, know where the siting of your structures for compost. Typically, it's best to avoid, right up against your neighbor's fence and things like that. Goes without saying, but still, if you're limited to where you can put it, then it's more about not necessarily not siting it there, but just making sure that you're actively, composting it, that you're actually moving the material and aerating it and creating an environment where aerobic bacteria can decompose it so that it, that smells earthy instead of that foul kind of sulfur smell, which is typically anaerobic bacteria when it sits and gets a lot of water on it. Another, great practice, best management practice for air quality considerations are things like no-till. Pasture grazing is no-till, really, unless you're going to completely reseed your pastures and start anew. So, minimizes dust, minimizes those kinds of things, particulate matter, and then windbreaks and hedgerows are becoming really popular. If you've not thought of one of those, it's, both great because it provides you with privacy, but it also captures any potential, stuff coming from your neighbors onto your land. Can be made out of trees or shrubs or both. I've also seen many livestock owners use it as like kind of a forage or a place of shelter, where we compose it of plants that are safe for the animals to eat, but oftentimes that's entertainment for them. It keeps them occupied. And I guess my sage wisdom there is just don't forget air quality does matter, even if we can't see it. And so keeping in mind things like particulate matter and dust and, how all those things can impact ourselves and our neighbors. Plants. Everyone likes plants. So some things to think about, are the plants you want a good match for the soils you have? Are you focused on productivity? Are you okay with it being a little weedy or a little, something weedy as in not toxic plants for animals, but weedy as in maybe some less desirable things in there, but they're not a huge percentage, or maybe it's really a problem. Maybe you have a large percentage of that stand of forage or that hedgerow that has a ton of weeds in it that's posing a threat to your animal's health. These are some considerations to think about. I list a few, types of legumes. A lot of folks had questions about, pasture types, what grasses, what cereal grains, what legumes. These are some common ones I know, especially for our equine owners, like the lucerne hay, alfalfa is great. Less likely to, be an issue with laminitis and things like that. More fibrous and also deeply rooted so that you can get lots of, multiple cuttings, especially in drier soils. So having a higher legume percentage might be in the cards for you if you're mostly grass dominated at this point. I'll cite clover, berseem clover. They're great. Berseem is more of like a cover crop in gardens, but can be used in pastures. But I tend to aim for 30% legumes in my pastures. And, in pasture situations, specifically with plants, since a lot of questions were focused on pastures, that's why I'm covering it. These are some of the common ones that do quite well in most soils on our island, things like orchard grass, timothy, perennial rye, winter rye. I'm not putting any fescues in there because I know that can be an issue with, endophyte issues with horses. But you can do like tall fescue, and there's some other fescues out there. You just need to make sure it's endophyte free. Generally speaking, it's good to, cite, have a 70% mixture. You can have more, but it's good to have a good legume with a good grass mix, and ideally a couple different kinds of grasses. A tool to be aware of is, and I'll again put this, I don't know if you have it accessible, Allison, at the moment, but it's the Pasture and Hayland renovation publication. I think you included it in the list to everybody. And I think this is on the second page maybe, but for our example property, you can see on the right-hand side here, let's see, can I zoom in here? I can't remember. No, I can't zoom into that, sorry. That the rectangle down there, you'll see that type of soil, the poorly drained soil on that example property is considered the saturated in late fall, winter, and spring. And so it gives you a recommendation of when to seed. And then it gives you an example of different kinds of forage and legume species and cereal grains for the different uses you might have. So maybe you're wanting it for just grazing land in your pasture, or maybe you have it for a paddock that's like a confinement area. And so it gives you some examples, but I'll take it even a step further. If you really geek out and you go to that Soil Web app and you find out the forage suitability group of your soil, it tells you then even more specifically these different recommendations. So it's essentially a little bit more refined to that soil type than it is just generally speaking over there in the Pasture and Hayland renovation publication. I can also help you with that, finding this. And then even further is better understanding those cool season grasses. Typically that's what we have here, what in the Puget Lowland area, what their growth phases are. So, especially those of you who have issues with, concern around grass founder and such, this is really good to know about when their, most increasing growth happens. That's kind of the dark blue, or not the dark blue, kind of light blue color. 5 is what it says. I kind of zone in yellow there for you because that is the months of November to roughly February 1st. And that is the time when when most plants, not just grasses and pastures, but when they're in dormancy. And so where you can limit activity on the plants and allow them to build up their energy reserves, build up those tillers, the likeliness you will have more robust plants in the future for grazing purposes. It also tells you when they go dormant briefly in August generally. And it was like literally late August. And I noticed every soil is a little different too. I've noticed that in little areas of my property, the water table literally drops. And it dropped a whole week earlier than another area. So my forage stayed a lot longer in one area than another. So you might notice that in your pastures if you've got a large enough area that you'll see those soil differences based on the water holding capacity. Here's just kind of a quick visual to show you the root growth and the shoot growth, how it kind of corresponds. So obviously the different times of the year and when it's, less likely to grow and such, kind of intuitive, but I thought, hey, what a cool visual, right? It shows you the more you allow those tillers to stay put in the winter, the more robust grass growth you'll have in the future and less likely you'll have to reseed. And here's kind of an example of what happens. I don't know why it's tilted, I'm sorry. I couldn't figure out why it's tilted on here, but here's an example of what happens with different types of grazing periods. So the continuous grazing, where animals are allowed complete access and free access to an area with minimal bringing back to their confinement. You can see that much shorter stubble height, usually it's below 4 inches stubble height. And then you can see that the root response is tinier roots. So obviously much more impacted, especially if you've got like a soil that's, you know, moderately to very well drained. That water table goes away, the soil storage and available water goes away, and then you have tiny roots, then of course you're going to have more stressed plants. So it's really interesting. Rotational grazing is definitely, everyone's got their own system that works for them, but it is definitely a management option that may be worth looking at if you've not tried it before with your animals, to not only increase their exercise and enjoyment of the pasture, but see if that might change the composition of your fields. We had a farmer that we went and did a walk with a while back who literally never had to reseed his pastures. It was continuously grazed by, it was a cattle operation, but continuously grazed for years and years and years, completely weedy, completely, you know, overgrown with undesirable species. And through rotational management of his herd over the period of 3 to 5 years, saw a complete change in the stand types without any input on his end other than managing the herd. So didn't have to import any seeds or anything, just literally managing the animals changed it completely. There was enough, obviously, of a seed table of different species that all of a sudden they came back up, which is really fascinating. And I know we're kind of at time. I have just a couple more slides, and then I definitely want, if you guys are willing to stick around with me for a little bit, we can answer some of those questions that I may not have answered yet, or I'm happy to also field those with Allison afterwards individually. But for plants and tips and tools, that soil test will help you answer that question of, are your nutrients out of balance? So get that soil test, super easy. We'll include a resource of how to go out and sample your soils and send them to a lab. There's some close ones nearby, and really they're like $15 a sample, and you get a pretty good analysis done from a professional laboratory to tell you that. What that will then tell you is, okay, wow, I do have a very, very deficient in nitrogen pasture. Maybe I should consider some, you know, adjustments there. Maybe my pH is out of whack. I should think about some lime, try that out. And doing liming and all these other choices before completely deciding to reseed is often better and more time efficient for you and money efficient. Try those things out first. Let's see, I think I've already said a lot of these things. Management with plants, selecting species suited to the site, definitely. And if you're not feeling confident around that, that's totally fine. I can definitely work with you and your needs on helping you navigate what works best. I put a native plant in there too for all the folks who want to do native plants on their land. And then animals. So our livestock's health is really important, right? Knowing what kind of forage they're eating, what access to water they have, their shelter, you know, what kinds of areas of confinement they have, fencing types and selections, and how you manage those conditions of mud in the wet season, since inevitably we all get wet. Also, at the same time, animals can include things like native wildlife habitat, right? Having those in tandem with your livestock ultimately helps both of them, right? Having our pollinators like the honeybee, and obviously those aren't native pollinators, but having pollinators like our native bees as well, and butterflies around just overall, generally speaking, helps, especially if you've got a cropped system and needing that needs pollination. So those are some considerations to think about. Some tips and tools for animals in general. I tend to encourage folks to think around the areas by your stables or where they're going to be confined in the winter, potentially, assuming they're confined in the winter, if that's a choice you make. Having areas of heavy use constructed out of materials like this, this hoof grid or gravel, making sure that you have an adequate depth of different sized cobble that has limited contact with the actual parent soil. I tend to see these heavy use areas sometimes get put in and then they don't actually have the fabric, and all of a sudden all the rock and all the crushed gravel just gets mushed in with the soil because that soil is wet in the winter and there's heaviness on it, and they have to start again. So really making sure that you have the right material and the right layering of those heavy use areas. With watering, ensuring that the watering system is, first of all, capable for your well to support, and the distance it takes for you to go out and water, if you're hand watering with a hose in a basin, or if you're going to have automatic waters. Those are really important things to think about from a frost perspective. This is where, the vegetation and livestock and wildlife can all work together. They all can work together with different practices that you have. And with animal health considerations, it's really important that we do that thoughtful planning and careful consideration of where to site, where they're going to spend a lot of time, because that can impact, obviously, hoof health and much more, right? So knowing the soils, again, harken back to the soils, knowing your landform and hydrology, where the water flows, really helps improve the potential of your livestock's health improving. And kind of lastly, I kind of lump these two together because, when you think of energy, a lot of folks think of lights, but it can be more than just that. I like to think about the energy, not just from an actual usage of lighting and energy to operate or farm or conduct business on your property, but also your own human energy, like how much time you want to spend on solving these issues, your economical time and social energy, how much you want to elicit the help of, say, a private contractor, knowing the community, who in the community does what service, those kinds of things. So planning your property based on your chore efficiency is going to really help you conserve that human energy, and also help you improve in the long run those natural resource considerations. And thinking too about, do you know your neighbors? How's your goal fitting into the bigger neighborhood or community context? It's always great when, you step back and you think about, what skills do my neighbors have that I don't, and vice versa, and how can we help each other out so that we don't have to sit and wait for 100 years for a contractor to help us, right? And I say that in a very joking and happy way because I have a husband who's a contractor, so I'm like, I know the world. So those are some things to think about from a human consideration of your property. I zoom in here. This is borrowed from fence planning and design for horses publication. Maybe Allison can find that. I like it because it's just simple. I did add a little bit to it. But having, if you have a dream about how you want the property to look or how you want to add on to what's already there, think about it in terms of siting, obviously, those paddocks, those heavy use areas closest to your structures. If you've got an arena, is that going to be close to where you can access your animals? With pastures, think about maybe using something like a paddock paradise. If you've heard of track paddocks or paddock paradises, those are ways in which you can incorporate more of a heavier use area around the perimeter of a pasture, and you fence it in such a way that encourages your horses or You can do it with other livestock. Typically it's associated with equines, but they are encouraged to move and it keeps them entertained. So having a more like a paddocked surface around the pastured areas then allows you then to move them into more of a rotational grazing. And really, there's not like a set science of, how long should I rotate my animals on this particular area. It really comes down to the amount of animals that you have, what their daily forage needs are, and the size of area that you're grazing. And it's a matter of how much time it takes them to graze from a specific height of forage down to a specific height of forage. So it's a very intimate and very specific relationship that you want to work with me or others on developing your own rotational grazing plan for that. And that ultimately does take a lot of human energy up front to learn and do, but ultimately in the long run, you may save yourself a lot of time, a lot of hassle from having to completely renovate something or have to start over, so it's, how much energy now versus later. I'd like to think that the, long-term, this one will prove to save you more energy. And I mentioned earlier on about learning about what are allowed uses on your land. That saves you a lot of headache having to try and find the right person to ask. Go to that land use table. I'll include that in the resource that we'll follow up with you on, of finding your zoning and finding what the use is. If it's not there and you're not sure, it's always good to just show up at the planning department's office. That's the best bet. Go in person. Don't email or call, just go in person and you'll get your questions answered there. And we have access to, we at the district have an access to our network of state and federal partners that have a lot of cost share program and financial assistance out there. So if I don't know the answer to a question, it's likely I have a colleague in another agency I can ask. And I want to dial you in with that. So don't be afraid to ask for help, connecting with folks like us for things like technical and financial assistance, and connecting with others around you. This is a picture of a farm tour we did years ago. We were looking specifically at folks who had manure storage facilities and what it took for them to get to that level. And this is a large facility for a large cattle operation, but then we went to some smaller ones to see it. So everyone got to talk and learn about the process, and that can be cost shared. And think about it in the context of, kind of my wisdom here. This is a really cute picture of a little boy from a few years back at a farm tour that I was at. And his mom was totally fine with me doing this. Apparently he's a model. He's like a little baby model. It's really cute. But he, thinking about the human component of what legacy are we leaving with how we manage our land. The next generation is going to thank us if we take the time to consider all of these factors in the planning and preparation of our properties. And so some tips to get started on your planning and implementing my top 7 goals. So kind of a reiteration. 1, define your goals by the land use that you have. And it's okay to dream ideal, but like I said, most folks I've worked with, who I work with again, touch base with them after a couple of years, they say, whoa, I really wish I hadn't done everything at once. Or maybe I should have taken more time to observe my property and found out this thing, that, or thing, or something else. So define your goals by land use and keep it real, but dream ideal. 2, by land use, get out there and take a look, see what you got. You now have some building blocks with soil, water, air, plant, animal, and the human and energy considerations of the land. And you now know the land uses. So you can kind of divide those up and do inventories by each. I would recommend, generally speaking, to spend at least a year on your property, if you've not yet already done it, and observe it throughout the seasons, because you'd be amazed if you buy a piece of property in summer, what you'll find out in the winter, right? Or vice versa. So, and I've had several folks recently tell me, that they really, they've appreciated having that time to not like make a decision about something and just to observe it, which then makes them decide to change the siding of their barn someplace else because they saw there was some water issues that they hadn't noticed firsthand when they bought it in the summer. Number 3, develop a realistic timeline for addressing those resource concerns you may have as part of that resource inventory. Everyone's heard of like, SMART objectives, time-bound, timeline. Number 4, identify those practices that assist you both in the short term. Vegetative practices tend to be short term, and then long term, like management practices. 5, obtain technical and financial assistance for these BMPs from folks like us and our partners. You'd be amazed at how many different cost share opportunities exists, not just USDA and districts, but our State Department of Natural Resources, U.S. Fish and Wildlife, a lot of nonprofits, specifically for helping with implementing practices on the land and providing assistance to you in doing that. And the last 2, number 6, execute those incremental changes, right? Kind of harkens back to don't do it all at once. See how each change that you make may affect other aspects of the land that you didn't think about. And lastly, build that community network and build that toolkit like you are tonight. Obviously, I can't share everything in an hour and a half, but I darn well tried. As far as the main themes that I've experienced with folks over the years that have proven successful for many of their different endeavors, and ask for help. You know a lot already, and I'm happy to help support you and find the answers to some of those questions that you might have. And with that, I see we have some questions. Do we want to stick around for another 10 minutes or so? Do folks feel like they have time and space for that? You thumbs up or yay. I can see you. I've been looking at you. All right. Great. So Allison, do you want to help kind of mitigate that? Thanks, Debbie. Yeah.
Sure. So going back to our first question, Mercy asks if she does a soil test and it tells me I need lime, would I put out my annual ryegrass and clover before or after I broadcast the seed? I usually wait for some rain to come before I put out the lime. Will lime on top of the seed cause failure to germinate?
So I would definitely recommend, I mean, I don't necessarily see it being a major failure, but I do think it's best to probably wait for some seeding unless it's like an absolutely important thing that you seed. Try your lime first. I'm not sure what you've got already there. And if it's just like certain areas of bare soil that you're trying to get back in, but getting the lime first and giving it time to soak in would probably be best. And then timing that, maybe doing like a spring seeding, because the grass will definitely, it will definitely seed next spring and probably would be, better. The only challenge I know with that is many of us want to bring our animals out in the spring, and we have to give that area some time to get established before we can put our animals out. Otherwise they'll pull the grass out. So does that answer your question? And we can definitely, explore that more too.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, no problem.
And then looks like Deborah had questions about mowing. What kind of mower attachment for a tractor is best for mowing a horse pasture, a flail mower, or a brush hog?
Oh, go ahead.
There's some follow-ups, but you can.
Oh, okay. I was gonna say overall, I will say, Debbie, that I am not an expert on equipment per se, but in my experience working with folks who are managing pasture settings, it's mostly brush hogs that I hear. Flail mowing, I tend to hear more in cropped like a vegetable cropping situation. Doesn't mean it necessarily is not going to work, but I hear it more commonly used as a brush hog in a mowing situation of a pasture.
And then when should we mow, or should we even mow? They're not currently mowing. And Deborah, if you want to jump in and share anything else, maybe it would be helpful to know if you're currently grazing it in addition, or if you're managing it for hay.
Maybe you can unmute her.
There, now she can hear you.
Okay.
Oh,
Sorry.
well,
I'm sorry. Can you hear me now?
yes.
You can hear me, right? Okay. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Well, the situation is we have one horse and we have 2.6 acres of pasture that's fenced for him. So we're grazing that. And we just want to know, when do we need to mow the pasture, or when should we mow it? Would we mow it in the spring after it gets to be, a certain height? But
Yeah.
like, why would, and then if we mow it, and I don't know if we have enough rain for it to grow back. I know, just
Those are all
kind of
great
Well, we
questions.
will-
Oh,
Those
Yeah,
are all
we
great
have-
questions, Debbie.
Yes. Something.
Oh.
Yeah, we have really well-drained soil. I mean, it never gets wet here.
Yeah.
And the horses on actually two pastures, they're both about an acre and a half each.
Okay.
And he never really eats it completely down. Right now, the grass is really high and it's gone to seed.
Okay.
So we're just wondering, should we mow that?
yeah, my husband thinks we should mow it like maybe next spring, but I'm afraid to mow it, and then we mow it, it won't rain, rain, let's say it won't rain, and then it won't grow up and my horse won't have much to eat. or will it improve the pasture?
No, that's all great. I think what the questions you're asking have a lot to do, not just, I think the mowing or haying, in your case, it sounds like you'd mow it and you'd leave the material on the ground, right? Haying would be, you're cutting it and you're baling it and you're taking it off site. And then grazing, obviously, all kind of function in a similar fashion. Right. And so generally speaking, what I like to do, if we were to say start in the springtime and kind of think in terms of the growing season for our forage and our pasture setting, ideally it's best to try and keep your grass height between 4 inches above the ground and 8 inches above the ground. So that range of height from a management perspective is the ideal kind of grazing height. So typically, you would mow when it would be above 4 inches, when it would be above 8 inches, or you'd graze right at 8 inches. And then you would observe, in the case of grazing, you would observe the animal until it got to 4 inches, and then you would turn the animal back onto the paddock or to a new pasture. So you would never go below 4 inches, if that makes sense. So same with like mowing. So if your horse is not able to keep up with the pastures, which is what it sounds like, and tends to maybe favor particular areas, you might consider bringing them in to a smaller area and doing like 4 little areas. You could use a, more of a psychological barrier with like high tensile electric wire or something that you could train your horse to then they'd still get the grass they like, but they wouldn't necessarily not get the other kind. So you wouldn't have like a mix of different heights there by having those slightly smaller areas. That's a long-winded answer, but in general, with mowing the pasture right now, specific to your question around right now, I would just say if you're gonna mow to no less than 4 inches. So don't go to 3, don't go to 2. That's gonna be a problem in terms of it would stress the plant and they wouldn't have nearly as deep of a rooting response. So mowing would be fine now. I mean, at this point, the plants, they'll have a slight regrowth you might, because you're gonna still wanna pasture your horses for a couple more months before it's really gonna get, to be the dormant season where the grass will not grow really at all for a few months before the spring, then you might consider maybe mowing it to like 6 inches and giving a little bit of stubble height for your horse to nibble on over the next couple of months in all of the pasture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I did have one question. The reason I brought up the flail mower,
Yeah.
because after reading about them and bringing them up, the thing I liked about them is it actually mulches the grass and doesn't leave just big, because we don't hay the field.
That's
So
true.
I mowed
Yeah.
it with as tall as it. Yeah, with a brush hog, it just leaves big.
It would just kind of leave
clumps of
that
grass
there,
all over the
right?
place.
Yeah, like I said,
Flail
I'm
mower
not.
will actually
I
mulch
can
it.
do a little more research for you because I'm actually really curious about it as well. That is definitely not as the equipment piece is. It's not something I've heard as much in the context of this. Typically, the folks I've worked with, they've hayed it or they've had someone come and hay it and take the hay off and that kind of thing. So I'll happily do a little research on and find out for you if it's a more, if it's something. I would think it's not a problem. I just think it's maybe less used than the brush hog for who I've worked with. So definitely, I'm sorry that I'm not an expert in that, but I definitely think that you're good either way.
Okay.
Okay, all right,
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, and feel
Thank
free
you.
to ask
That
more
was-
questions if you've got more. Like, I think the goal here is, generally speaking, try to aim for that 4 to 8 inch window throughout the year and not go below
Okay.
it and try not to go above it, if that makes sense.
Yes, yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, that helps a lot. We were confused about the mowing and